One of the most famous groups of people who attempted to travel to Sutter's Fort in the 1840s is the Donner Party. On May 12th, 1846, the Donner and Reed families departed from Independence, Missouri, the jumping off point for the Oregon-California Overland Trail. The day prior, Tamsen Donner wrote a letter to her sister saying, "This season we go to California. It is just 4 months' trip. We have 3 wagons furnished with food and clothing, drawn by 3 yoke of oxen. I am willing to go, and I have no doubt it will be an advantage for our children and to us." Roughly 2,000 miles were ahead of them of their destination being Sutter's Fort. They joined a large wagon party captained by Colonel William H. Russell, consisting of dozens of wagons and families. Roughly 1,500 people were traveling west in 1846. What made them famous was that they did not reach their destination as planned. So what went wrong? Well, first of all, they left at the end of the recommended time to head on the Overland Trail. As evident in Tamsen's letters, they were also bringing a lot more than what they needed for the trail as well, and had extra wagons loaded with supplies not necessary for their journey. The Reeds had what became known as the Palace Wagon. That was a 2-story wagon that included a stove. It was far larger than the normal farm wagon, which would be 10 foot by 4 foot wide, and they had this wagon to be outfitted to make Margaret Reed's mother, Sarah Keyes, feel more comfortable for the journey. Sarah, however, died of tuberculosis just 17 days after the group left Independence, Missouri. It was not until July 19th, 1846, when a group of American immigrants decided to venture away from the established trail and to take a new route called Hastings Cutoff, which was promoted by Lansford Hastings in his new guidebook, The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. The group then elected George Donner as their leader, thus creating the Donner Party. On July 28, 1846, the Donner Party reached Fort Bridger. They stayed at the fort for 3 days to rest their livestock and make repairs on their wagons before starting the new route called Hastings Cutoff. Former fur trapper Jim Bridger established Fort Bridger, located in what is today southwestern Wyoming, in 1842 as a trading post. Bridger promoted the new cutoff just as Lansford Hastings did. Bridger was hoping that the success of the cutoff would attract more wagons to stop by his establishment along the trail. After all, the Donner Party was not the first group to take Hastings Cutoff. Lansford Hastings was guiding the Harlan Young Party on the cutoff 11 days ahead of the Donner Party. Traversing the cutoff made the Harlan Young Party the last overland group to cross the Sierra into California in 1846. Just before the Donner Party departed Fort Bridger, James Reed wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, Gershom Keyes. At the end of the letter, Reed stated, "Mr. Bridger informs me that this route we will take is a fine level road with plenty of water and grass. It is estimated that 700 miles will take us to Captain Sutter's Fort, and we hope to make it in 7 weeks from this day." On September 26, 1846, the Donner Party reached the end of Hastings Cutoff and rejoined the California Trail about 7 miles west of present-day Elko, Nevada. They spent almost 2 months traversing the cutoff, following brief suggestions given by Lansford Hastings. Taking the supposed shorter route, Hastings Cutoff actually added an additional 130 miles onto their journey. They also traveled slower because the group had to essentially create their own path, which put them even farther behind schedule and even lower on supplies. While crossing the Great Salt Lake Desert, livestock were lost, many of them abandoned wagons. It was at this time that 8-year-old Patty Reed will hide a small doll in her apron pocket instead of abandoning it with many of her family's belongings along Hastings Cutoff. Realizing that supplies were running low, Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon will travel ahead to get potential supplies from Sutter's Fort and travel back east to rejoin the group. Once the group rejoined the established California Trail and were clearly behind schedule, tensions were running high amongst the Donner Party. On October 5th, 1846, while crossing the Pauta Pass, a dispute took place between some entanglement of ox teams pulling some wagons. And those wagons were wagons belonging to the Graves family and the Reed family. Now, Milt Elliott was the teamster for the Reeds, and John Snyder was the teamster for the Graves family. A dispute took place in which would lead to James Reed getting involved between the two men, and James Reed will be hit by a whip that was belonging to John Snyder, in which James Reed will kill John Snyder. Now, this led to a lot of issues on whether or not this was self-defense or anything like that. Lewis Keseberg did offer the tongue of his wagon to potentially hang James Reed right along the California Trail, but the group decided that they were going to banish James Reed to travel ahead to California on his own, ahead of the group. Charles Stanton will return to the Donner Party on October 19th, 1846, along the Truckee River with 7 pack mules loaded down with supplies and 2 of the most trusted California Native American workers that were here at Sutter's Fort. That were Lewis and Salvador. Now, these guys, especially Lewis, was mentioned a lot in the New Helvetia Diary, the daily logbook that was kept right here in the clerk's office at Sutter's Fort. The fate of the Donner Party would be much different if it wasn't for these 3 guys arriving with those 7 pack mules. The Donner Party will reach Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, on October 31st, 1846. And they were greeted with snow. They could no longer travel farther west. The majority of the group of the 81 American immigrants passed Truckee Lake with about 8 inches of snow on the ground that fell the night before. They were 3 miles from the summit when they reached a point where the snow was higher than the axles on their wagons. They could not travel any further. Some tried to go farther without wagons, but they soon had to find themselves retreating back to Truckee Lake. It also didn't help that they could no longer see the California Trail. They truly could not move farther west. At the lake, the immigrants found a cabin. This cabin was built 2 years prior by the Murphy Stevens Townsend party who had traveled west in 1844. Now, because the California Trail had not been fully established yet to be able to get wagons over the Sierra, a cabin was built for Moses Schallenberger, who was left behind in that winter to watch those wagons. That cabin was still there. The Donner Party decided to wait out what they thought was going to be a short storm and that they would continue on after the storm had passed. That's what they had hoped for. That didn't happen. The Breen family moved into Schallenberger's cabin. Lewis Keseberg will build a lean-to next to that cabin. The Murphy, Eddy, Foster, and Pike families built a cabin against a large boulder about 200 yards from the other cabin. The Graves and Reed families shared a cabin a short distance away. A total of 59 people were in those 3 cabins near the lake. About 6 miles east on Alder Creek, the Donner families, Mrs. Wolfinger, their teamsters, and others made up about 3 shelters using canvas, hides, and brush. A total of 22 people were at Alder Creek. The Donner Party had traveled 2,000 miles to get to Truckee Lake, but they were less than 150 miles from Sutter's Fort. While snowbound, supplies began to dwindle. Patrick Breen begins to start keeping a diary on November 20th, and his bleak accounts of the weather paint a true picture of how doomed this group really was. However, there were initial attempts at help. Traditional Native American Washoe accounts share that the Washoe villages in that area actually attempted to bring food to the weary travelers that were stuck at the lake. But those that were at the lake decided to potentially attack or even shoot at the Washoe who were trying to bring them food. Over some time, it was decided that there wasn't going to be any sort of snow melt or anything like that. Supplies were really dwindling. They needed to find a way out and let people know that there was people trapped in the Sierra. They had exhausted all their resources of eating mice, rats, boiling cowhides, and boiling tree bark, and even boiling their shoes for food. On December 16th, 1846, a group of 17 people, known to history as the Forlorn Hope, left Truckee Lake on improvised snowshoes. Their mission: find a way to reach Sutter's Fort and get assistance for the Snowbound Donner Party. They packed light by only carrying a blanket each, the clothes on their backs, food rations to last for just a week, a rifle, and a couple pistols. The next day, Charles Berger and 10-year-old William Murphy turned back before reaching the summit. Charles Stanton, Lewis, and Salvador initially led this group. On December 21st, Stanton suffered from severe snow blindness and was left beside a tree smoking his pipe. The travelers soon found themselves caught in a snowstorm, lost and completely out of rations. The group huddled around a fire that they were able to light and drew straws on who they would have to sacrifice in order to survive. However, no one could bring themselves to commit such an act. On December 24th, however, Frank Graves and Antonio passed away. The next day, Patrick Dolan passed, and Lemuel Murphy passed away a day after that. After camping for 4 days without traveling, struggling to keep that fire going, and without any food, the group resorted to eating themselves for survival. The travelers finally left what became known to history as the Camp of Death on December 30th. The Forlorn Hope continued their journey following the tracks of Lewis and Salvador, for almost every one of the travelers had left bloody footprints from their frostbitten feet. Jay Fosdick passed away on January 6th, and William Eddy was able to kill a deer. On the 9th, William Foster, who had gone completely mad from starvation, killed the very weak Lewis and Salvador. They are the only individuals to be considered part of the Donner Party to have been killed for food. On the 12th, they followed a trail to a California Native American village who welcomed them with food. The very weak group continued on. William Eddy, who had paid 2 California Native Americans to drag him to the closest rancho, arrived at Johnson's Ranch on the Bear Creek near present-day Wheatland on January 17, 1847. Upon Eddy's arrival, the people at Johnson's Ranch were horrified at the sight of Eddy, who was emaciated and could not walk. They followed Eddy's bloody footprints to find the rest of the Forlorn Hope. Of the 15 members of the Forlorn Hope, 7 survived. William Eddy, William Foster, Mary Ann Graves, Sarah Graves Fosdick, Sarah Foster, Amanda McCutcheon, and Harriet Pike. What was planned to take just 10 days, the 7 survivors of the group reached Johnson's ranch 33 days later. Word spread throughout California about the tragedy of the Forlorn Hope, especially after a letter by John Sinclair describing the plight of the Donner Party was sent to Washington Bartlett, the alcalde of San Francisco. The letter was later published in the California Star newspaper. Rescue parties were soon formed to save the Donner Party. Over a series of 4 relief parties, James Reed leading the second one, the survivors of the Donner Party were rescued. 45 members survived, while 44 perished. Many of the rescuers were from Sutter's Fort, and those who were rescued were eventually brought here. What is remembered most in popular culture about the Donner Party is the subject of cannibalism, which many did not actually partake in order to survive. Throughout the history of the Donner Party, Charles Stanton is remembered as the hero. While he was the one who went back, it was Lewis and Salvador who truly brought the supplies with them to travel with Stanton from Sutter's Fort to Truckee Lake. Lewis and Salvador were responsible for the survivors of the Forlorn Hope and later the survivors of the Donner Party. The story of the Donner Party is deeply connected to Sutter's Fort and California state parks. The Sutter's Fort collection is actually the largest repository of Donner Party materials in the state of California's collection, and most of those items are related to Patty Reed Lewis, not just her famous doll.